Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of the Audi 100 series. In part 1 we purchased this boat we call Dimitri. We took a look at all the work that needs to be done to it to get it on the road again, while trying to stay under a budget of 1500 euros. If you haven't seen that video yet, go check it out, the link is in the description.
All my friends, yellow rider.
So Tibo rolled up with Dimitri in order for us to perform a hefty list of fixes in the upcoming days. But there already have been some things done to the car since you guys saw it the last time. First of all, he replaced the terrible tires that were on it. Since we are working with a tight budget of 350 euros, a new set of tires would bite a big chunk out of the budget. So we looked for a set of used rubber and quickly found a set of wheels and tires for 50 euros. And they are in excellent condition, so that is already a good start budget-wise. The second thing that got fixed off camera are the rust bubbles that were on the front fenders. Tibo had to wait for the parts that he has ordered for today's episode, so in the meanwhile he attempted to clean up the bodywork. To do this he had to cut out the entire section of fender and weld in new metal, then add some Bondo, sand it down and then primer and paint it. He painted it with paint matched rattle cans and I have to say that the result is pretty good. The fender will need some wet sanding and a polish to remove some overspray and then it will be almost perfect. Another thing that got done off camera was that the car got a fresh batch of oil and a new oil filter. So that's something we don't have to do today. So now that you guys are up to speed, we can continue the Audi's journey to roadworthiness. Tibo has bought a large quantity of parts from our friends over at Autodoc and we are going to install all of them using my lift. Before we start working, I'll give you guys a rundown on all the parts that Tibo has bought and at the end of the video we'll do a cost breakdown on everything. For the brakes we are going to replace all the rotors and pads. For the cooling, Tibo has bought a new radiator because we found that the old one was leaking. We're also going to install a new water pump with a new thermostat and we are going to throw on 2 new temperature sensors. Next we move to the driveline. One of the axle boots has started ripping, so that needs replacing. He also has bought a new clutch because we suspect it's on the verge of failing and we are also going to install a new seal for the shift linkage. The suspension seems okay, but we have to paint the springs so that it is less noticeable that they are lowering springs. For the steering we need to replace the boot around the steering rack because that has ripped. Luckily the owner had a spare one for us, so we didn't have to buy that. To make the exhaust legal, Tibo has also purchased a new muffler to replace the section of pipe that is currently in the exhaust. So that is quite a lot of things that we have to do to get Dimitri through mandatory inspection, so we better start working on this thing ASAP.
Precies gewoon niks meer hoor. Expressie.
Oh yeah, another thing that got handled before this video was the surface rust on the inside of the wheel wells. Tibo sanded up all the rust and then put a coating over it on both sides. We're starting by taking off all the brake components and the strut assembly so that the springs can get painted and the brakes replaced.
Leo.
Perfect.
Ja, is goed.
Gotcha.
Nice. Mate, dat is goed getimed. I noticed that the springs in the rear don't have a lot of tension on them, so I just blew off the top mount with the impact. In the front, I'm using a set of spring compressors to do this. Then we can start working on removing the gearbox to replace the clutch. The first step in this process is to remove the axles. The front section of the exhaust prevents us from reaching the bolts of the right axle, so we are going to take it off completely, since we also have to cut out a section of this exhaust to make room for the new muffler. But to do that, we need to remove this cross section.
Douwen.
After I unbolted parts of the hub, there was enough room to get the axles out. So that means we can drop the gearbox.
Wel je die haakse afgaan, nee.
Then the pressure plate can be removed.
Hier is nog een pinnetje. Hier zit nog een pinnetje. Wacht, ik blijf even een kant op de vis.
Ja, dat vliegt wel.
Ik heb hem, ja.
It is amazing that the clutch still grabbed as well as it did, since it is worn out past the rivets holding it together. Luckily, it only scratched the pressure plate side, so the flywheel is still okay. Now that we have all this room, we can start working on replacing the steering rack boot. To get to it, we have to remove the brake booster and master cylinder. While Tibo and me focus on that, Jasper and Arno are starting to sand the springs so that they can be sprayed into a more legal color. While the paint is drying, they also attempt to replace one of the CV boots since it has started to crack. And yes, we only had one glove available. While Tibo was struggling with the brake booster, the boot of the CV got replaced successfully, so Jasper already started to reassemble the brakes with the new rotors and pads. Eventually the brake booster surrendered, clearing the path towards the steering rack bolts. It is great fun to jump into a project like this with some mates and it is really satisfying to get so much work done in a small period of time. While Tibo and Arno are working on removing the steering column, Jasper is still working on the brakes and I start to reassemble the rear strut assemblies. Nonetheless, we are slowly running out of daylight, mostly due to the steering rack being a giant pain in the neck. But eventually, after a lengthy battle, long after the sun has set, Dimitri managed to give birth to his steering rack. This job took way longer than we expected, which means that the car will not get finished tonight. So to end the night we are replacing the booth on the rack, reinstalling it into position and then call it a night. So yeah, yesterday night we just stopped working on the car because all of us were beat. But everything that needed to be taken off the car has been taken off and we actually started rebuilding some stuff. As you can see, the steering rack is back in. I think we did the rear brakes or only one corner, I'm not sure. The guys aren't here yet, so I'll take this as an opportunity to show you guys what we have done yesterday because it was kind of dark in the end. So yeah, let's go over everything. So Dimitri is still suspended on the lift and it is far from being ready to be dropped on the ground again. The front strut assembly on both sides needs to be mounted together with the new brake discs and pads. In the rear the brakes are done, but to finish the rear axle the struts need to be reinstalled. But before we can reinstall them, the newly painted springs have to be put back onto the shock absorbers together with the top mount. The drive shafts are ready to go back in, but before we can do that the new clutch needs to be mounted so that the gearbox can go on. Yesterday night we did finish the steering rack and repositioned the brake booster and master cylinder. I started with rebuilding the rear strut assemblies so that the work on the rear wheels is done. Then Tibo and me tried to install the clutch and gearbox.
Je moet vasthouden. Ja, als ik nu zo'n pinnetjes krijg is het toch goed. Zo.
With the clutch alignment tool removed and the clutch bolts torqued to spec, the clutch is done and we can focus on the gearbox. Before it goes on, it receives a new seal for the shifting mechanism and a new release bearing. To finish the work on the driveline, we only have to bolt the axles back in and then that is done. After the front struts and brakes were installed, we are bleeding Dimitri's brakes so that he can tailgate people with the most precision possible. It is an Audi after all. Another important aspect to the car's reliability is the cooling system, so that is what we are going to focus on right now. We want to replace some stuff, but before we can do that we have to drain the coolant from both the radiator and the engine.
Is dat een nummer? Ja. Alleen hè. Oh man, dat is ook wel echt zwaar natuurlijk.
After Dimitri made PP once more, we are removing the water pump to replace it. Before we took off the water pump, it was working fine, but it is good that we did some preventative maintenance because one of the vanes on the old pump broke off. Tibo has also bought a new set of temperature sensors because the reading on the dashboard cluster was questionable at best. Then we got to replacing the radiator as we noticed that there is a small leak in the bottom left corner that we missed in the previous video. After we installed the fresh new one, the whole cooling system can be put back together with a new water pump and a new accessory belt. With all the work done on the engine, only one job remains, which is mounting the new exhaust muffler. Sadly, the one that we ordered did not fit exactly due to the pipe being too short and the mounting flange being too wide, so we had to make some modifications.
Output cement. Ja. Ik vind dat er gewoon nog verdacht gemakkelijk op gaat.
The modified exhaust fits beautiful, so that means we should be finished with everything on our to-do list. The last thing we have to do is refill it with fluids before we can start the engine again.
Let's go to play. Hij gaat er nog niet.
The engine seems to be running fine, so we are going to put the wheels back on and lower the Audi again for the first time in 2 days. We thought he was ready for action, but Tibo spotted another important defect that needs what I call percussive maintenance.
Ja. Broke. Fixed.
We took it for a small test drive and everything seemed fine, which means that the rebuild of this car is done for now. We are very happy that we got so much done in this little time frame, and we'll end this video by giving you guys a rundown on everything that we have spent on Dimitri. The wheels and tires we bought secondhand were 50 euros. The gear that we used to restore the front fenders and paint the springs was around 50 euros as well. The exhaust muffler that we bought from eBay was around 47 euros. A big list of replacement parts was bought from Autodoc for 370 euros, which added with what we paid for the car gives us a total of 1667 euros, which means that we are slightly over budget by 167 euros. But to be honest, we are delighted that we managed to get all of this done for the amount that we did. As soon as we inspected the car, we were worried that getting this thing back in shape cheaply would be difficult, especially since it needed new tires on all 4 wheels. But finding that second-hand set of wheels for 50 euros, together with the relatively cheap parts from Autodoc, really helped us keeping the costs down. So that is everything for this episode. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, consider subscribing. In a future episode we'll take Dimitri for a spin and I'll update you guys on if it passed inspection or not. Until next time.